All right. Is it still hiccuping? Am I hiccuping? Can I even hear myself? I can't hear myself, which is probably okay. Oh, I know why. It's because I've got OBS up as well. That's probably why I was hiccuping too. Okay. Well, I can't hear myself, which is fine because there's going to be a lot of me hearing me. I'm actually now just waiting for the Inception level stuff to start. I mean, I guess it's already started. The video within the video within the video within the video. See, every time you see that logo, it happens and it goes deeper and deeper and deeper. If the lag wasn't so long, then it would be even faster and it would be cooler. So thanks for joining, everybody. In this video, so the other night I did a live stream where I went through the stats and I was making the quick start video, but problem was that I wasn't happy with it. So yesterday, without doing a live stream, I made a stats update. video. And I brought it here into Premiere, and I'm going to edit it. But it's also a good opportunity to answer questions about the module system. So if you are unfamiliar, Game Modules is a package I have on the Asset Store. You can find it by going to infinitypbr.com and clicking on here. That is my affiliate link, which means that if you buy other things, we get a small cut. So that's great. That's right. That's right, Sandor. That's exactly right. I do remember as a kid, my parents, in one house we lived in, had closet doors that were mirrors on both sides. And that was the first experience I had where I could stand between them and just like see infinitely back, you know. That was always fun. So the Game Modules is a whole bunch of basically systems designed to create, manage, and make use of data. So it's what I'm using in my game Legend of the Stones, and it has a combination of modules, which I classify as things that are flexible. They don't require you to do specific things, and then systems like what you're seeing here is the inventory system, which are very specific. If you need this drag and drop system, then this is the way to go. It's making use of the modules. It's making use of the loot box module, the items module, and of course the items can make use of the skills or stats module. But you can use those without, I mean, you can use any inventory system you want. It doesn't really matter. You can create your own inventory system. You could probably use other assets inventory systems. You just have to link them together, and it's not terribly difficult to do that. But the modules are flexible, and they're designed to make it so that you don't have to do things the way that I've done things. You can create things and use them in different ways. But that flexibility also creates a level of ambiguity, I think, where you know, something like RPG Builder, you get what you see, and that, you know, if you want that, that's what you're going to get, and you're going to get all of those systems, and it's going to be great. But for me, when making my RPG, I didn't want that. I wanted things that it didn't have, and I didn't want to have to hack a system. And so I started creating my own and releasing those. So that's what we've got here: stats, items, inventory, basic first-person movement, character creation scene that I still have to update to the new version. Game time, again, very basic. And loot box, which I didn't list here. Why didn't I list loot box? But loot is also here as well now. So we have scripting docs available on this site. This has mostly been updated as well. I need to add more. There's plenty more I can add. My problem is that I can always add more. And so I need to update the code example as well. I can always add more, so I need to do that whole thing where you step between adding and releasing. So I actually have more to add to this. As I was making this video, I fixed some things, and then I was like, I need to add that, but I also need to get this video out. So let me get the video out, and then I'll add the things I want to add. So there you go. Let me also fix my audio. I want to make sure that I'm able to hear my computer here. Setup guide for the Game Modules bundle. So you guys can hear that, huh? But not me. Oh, this is... Alright. That's a problem, because now I do need to hear that. Alright, let me do it like this instead. Audio sound. I will play it through my normal speakers.
Well, right now on the...
Okay, and we will mute the music. Hey. Didn't mean to record audio. Mute that and lock it. I'm going to take off my headphones. So now I'm going to... Well, I guess you can hear the video through the microphone. We'll pick it up, but that's fine. So as a viewer here, it's not going to be the most exciting video. I'm just going to be editing. And Jason Storey, if you're here, I actually have a question for you. I've forgotten the hotkey that you helped me set up that would do a ripple delete or ripple edit. And so if you remember what that hotkey was, that'd be helpful. But if you have any questions about any of the stuff we make, Infinity PBR makes, or specifically the game modules, ask in the comments or the chat, and I will attempt to answer those questions. Otherwise, I'm going to... Hey. and this went smaller. I'm going to make this video.
Hey there, welcome to the quick setup guide for the game module.
And let's see how quick it can be. It's an hour and 40 minutes of a video, but a lot of it, I think, is me just talking and figuring things out.
Yeah, on the Unity Asset Store. And we're going to get us started with the stats and the items. And so let's get right into that. I'm going to be following along. If you go to infinitypbr.com and click on scripting docs, you'll come to this site. And I'm going to be basically going through the stats and the items section here to get those set up in a very simple demo scene, very simple to the demo scene that comes with the bundle. But I wanted to walk through was mostly outlined here and replace this video. This is an older video in a very simple demo scene, very simple to the demo scene.
It's supposed to be very similar to the demo scene. Oh, well.
That's in the items section here.
You can cut there and just skip to the get right to it part.
We're recording now. Continue on by adding some items, and we're going to use this scene the items section here, and we're going to use this scene and this basic demo scene to have some buttons to equip our character or player with various stats and items.
Sounds good. Let's do that.
So I've created a demo player here, and let's get this set up. The first thing is completely empty. I'm assuming you're going to have your own player class. Let me rename this real quick appropriately. And I'm going to start by implementing to do. This is completely empty. And I'm going to...
I should cut that rather than include it. To do. This is completely empty. And I'm going to start by implementing I have stats. This is our PBS screen
system for just laying the script. Know that you have stats, and you can then pass this object around to the stats system. We have all these members that methods that must implement. So I'm going to bring those all in, and we're going to do a trick here. I'm going to actually.
I think I don't actually do the trick, if memory serves.
We're going to do a trick here. Alright, and the next thing is I'm going to start just like the demo scene.
There were quite a few times during this that things just didn't work, and I was like, wait, why didn't it work? And a couple of times I had to fix bugs.
Alright, and then the next thing is I'm going to start just like the demo scene and create two lists of stats. And this is actually going to be a public game stat list. This is one of the objects that we have available to you, or the classes we have available to you. This is one of the classes we have available to you. It's explained on the docs, but essentially is a list of stat objects with some helper methods as well. So we're going to have one for stats, and we're going to make sure we initialize that.
I'm going to redo this voiceover.
Game stat list for skills as well. And then the next thing is I'm going to start just like the demo scene.
I think I'll make this 10 seconds long. Not 10 frames. 10 seconds. Let's see.
All right, and then the next thing is I'm going to start just like the demo scene. All right, and then I'm actually going to just copy these methods.
All right, let's do my voiceover.
The next thing is I'm going to start just like the demo scene.
Create 2 game stat. Oh man, I gotta mute myself, I guess, when I do the recording. Otherwise, you get that echo.
The next, I'm going to start just.
All right, wait a minute. All right. Round 3, fight. Creating a skill and a stats game stats list.
Like the demo scene, creating a skill and a stats game stats list. All right.
Well, that was louder than the rest.
The demo scene, creating a skill and a stats game. Game stats list. All right. And then I'm actually going to just copy these methods from the demo scene, and we'll go through them as we need them. But that way I can just kind of get through that.
Now, I don't know if I actually did copy them. Can't remember. Seems to be a lot of dead space.
All right, so I've copied most of these over, and we have a couple errors here because
all right, I found the hotkey. It's A. It's a hotkey.
All right, so I've copied most of these over, and we have a couple errors here because, of course, the demo scene has some things that we don't have yet. So I'm going to comment out this. And on the set dirty here, I'm also going to add a new method called isSetup. We'll put that up here.
All right, I'm going to do a voiceover for this part as well to shorten this up. Actually, let me do the voiceover part first. So copying, I did have some errors because missing features from the demo scene that we don't have yet. So I'm just going to comment those out and do a few other, tidying up and housekeeping things here.
Get through that. So copying, I did have some errors because missing.
Oops.
We're just going to return true for now.
Let's get to the good stuff.
We'll change that to the method. Oftentimes I do this.
I need to talk about that.
But I like to have it as a best practice. So then the other thing here is this get other levels. In the demo scene, we have the character class and the character race. That's something we can add later in the get other levels is essentially a way to gather all the different things like item objects and item attributes, or other stats that aren't listed in the main stat list that might modify all of the stats that are in the stat list. The stat system will auto recompute itself, and it knows about all the stats that are attached to itself, but it doesn't know directly about any other levels like modification levels that might come from item objects or item attributes, modifications and conditions.
Michael, I'll have to come back to that at the end. I didn't know that.
Spells, buffs, equipment, and so on that your character might have that need to be included. And so you include all of those here in this get other levels method, resulting with a list of these modification levels. We'll get into that in a bit. All right, now that we have that, let's go ahead and create some stats. All right, now that we have that, let's go ahead. Tidying up and housekeeping. Let's go ahead and create some stats that we can actually work with.
Well, that was a bad cut.
Tidying up and housekeeping. Let's go.
Ah. There we go. Right-click on the clip and select frames. I don't have a frames option. Do I? I'm not seeing it. It's possible.
Let's go ahead and create some stats that we can actually work with this game stat list.
Let's do that.
And one more, a very important thing I want to point out is this tick here.
Well, let's move this forward though.
So the game stat and game stat list, those don't have.
Oh, and apparently I stopped talking.
So is this tick here. Before we create the stats, though, I want to point out this tick method here. The stats and the game stats and the game stats and the game stats and the game stats list don't have an update method. They're not mono behaviors, so they don't have update and late update. So instead, we use this tick and late tick. This is something that you just have to call yourself. So we're going to call tick, which will call tick on skills and stats. And if you just go into that, you'll realize that tick here, and if we go into our stats, go into that, if you just tick on skills and stats, the game stats and if we go into our stats list, we'll find that tick basically calls for every game stat in this list, tick, and late tick does the same, but late tick. And this is a method that's used so that we can get the update functionality without having these classes be mono behaviors.
Sounds good to me.
And one more, a very important thing I want to point out is this tick here. out is this tick here, and therefore in our mono behavior here.
Well, I clearly am missing a chunk. What did I do?
Tick, which we'll call tick on skills and stat, and therefore in our mono behavior here, the game stats and the game stats list don't have an update method.
Wait a minute. Oh, I see what I did. Think.
Let's go ahead and create.
Yeah, so I want this to be after these two.
Mono behaviors, so they don't have update and late up.
There we go.
On skills and stat. Let's go.
Okay, hold on.
Tick on skills and stats. Let's just go ahead and go into stats that we can actually work with. Let's call tick on skills and stats, and if you just go into have a public update, well, stat, and therefore in our mono behavior here, we do need to have a public update. Well, let's go ahead and create some stats.
All right, what the heck?
Let's go ahead and create
some
stats that we can actually. We do need to have an update.
Man, the spacebar is being laggy.
And one more very important thing I want to point out is this tick here. The game stats and the game stats list don't have an update method. They're not mono behaviors. So they don't have update and list.
Wait, what was the D? I relearned the A. I was trying to find it yesterday, but I couldn't find it. But what was the D? What does D do?
Late update. So instead we use this tick and late tick. This is something that you just have to call yourself. So we're going to call tick, which we'll call tick on skills and stat. Late tick. This is something that you just have to call yourself.
D does the cut.
And therefore, in our mono behavior here, we do need to have a public update. Well, we do need to have an update where we just call tick. And just for good measure, we'll say if, let's go ahead and protected name.
So in the player class update, we're just going to make sure we have tick called, and tick will call tick on both of the stats and skills lists.
Say if, let's go ahead and create some stats that.
That's not yet. Let's get to.
Let's create our first stat in this week.
All right, well, I'll just cut it here then.
So let's create.
Apparently I did forget D, or to use it at least. Let's see.
So let's create our first stat. In this video demo folder, I'm going to create a folder, and we're going to call this stats. We'll just call it stats for now. Keep it fairly simple. And inside that, I'm going to right-click to create, game modules, create, and choose stat. Now, I'm going to name this experience, and we're going to just check out what this experience stat is. This is a common stat that I think many games will have. So if we click on that, we'll see that a couple things. One, it is called stats is the type. In fact, I'm going to type. In fact, I'm going to rename this just regular stat. And you can see that updates here. The object type of any one of these objects, the stats or the item objects or item attributes, are going to be the parent, the name of the parent folder. Attributes are going to be the parent, the name of the parent. The name of the attributes are going to be the name of the parent folder. So this is a parent folder. So this is a stat called experience, and it is a stat. And then we're going to click on main settings here. So this has some options for can be trained, can be modified. What that means is if it can be trained, that means that there's going to be this concept called...
Oh, bug alert. I'm about to have a bug.
So all stats can affect other stats, but if it can be trained or can be trained, can be modified, what that means is if it can be trained, that means that there's can be trained, can be modified. So all stats can affect other stats, but if it can be trained, then you're going to be able to assign a mastery levels object. We'll get into that a little bit later, but that means that the stat itself is intended to be something that the player during the game can advance their mastery of. One example in the demo scene would be a novice, expert, and a master level, and each one can have slightly different or completely different effects on other stats. The thinking being that as they get more advanced, the effect is a greater effect. But many stats are not going to be something that can be trained. They're not even something that maybe the player will see. In fact, after the experience, we're going to create a stat that the player likely wouldn't see, but it would affect the game nonetheless. The player likely wouldn't see, but it would affect the game nonetheless. And then this other one is can be modified. This doesn't modified. This doesn't have a huge effect, except that it won't show up in other stats' ability to modify things if it can't be modified.
No, Jason. You see, I cannot listen to things at fast speed. My brain doesn't work like that. So I will never, ever listen to anything at 2x speed or even doing the editing, because I need to hear what I'm saying and know whether I'm doing it right or not, unfortunately.
So if you want this to be modified by other stats, by item objects, etc., then turn that on. Otherwise, keep it off. For this, we're going to keep experience just as a tracker of the points, the experience points the player has. So we don't need this specifically to be modified. And then the settings down here, we have points, base value, base proficiency. These are the main numbers that come up, that make up the numbers that come up, that numbers that come up, that make up the final numbers, that make up the final stat of the experience. Final stat of the experience. And the algorithm is on, and the algorithm is on. Now, the algorithm final stat. The algorithm is listed here, but essentially it is listed here, but essentially it. So the algorithm is listed here. Stat. So the algorithm is listed here, but essentially it's a points plus base value plus all the points plus base value plus all the modifiers to place base value, and that equals your final base value. And then your base proficiency plus all the modifiers to that base proficiency equal your final proficiency, and the final stat is going to be that final base value multiplied by 1 plus the final proficiency. The thinking here and the logic behind this is that points are points is going to be that final base value multiplied by 1 plus the final proficiency. Points are a number that the player can change. So in this case, with experience, when they defeat a monster or solve a quest, we're going to change. So in this case, with experience, when they defeat a monster or solve a quest, we're going to give them points, some experience points. That's not something that can be modified by. That's not something that can be modified by other stats or items or something. It's more of a tracker. Where
You guys, you gotta remember, I actually got myself a film degree back in the day, and 20 years ago, I was really fast at Final Cut Pro. But Final Cut Pro today is very different, and I was confused.
Whereas base value is, again, it's a float number, and it can be modified. Whereas base value is, again, it's a float number, and it can be modified by other stats. And the final value is going to be these. Value is going to be these two added together: points, which are accumulated throughout the game, and then the base value, which might be modified by other things in the game. And then the proficiency starts at 0, and at 0 it means that there's no positive or negative change to that final value. It's going to be multiplied, that final value, by 1 plus whatever this final value is. So 0 would be 1, its final value is. So 0 would be 1, so you just get the two numbers combined. Other stats, other item objects, and item attributes can affect the proficiency of a stat, and that could result in the stat, the final number, being higher or lower than the points plus final base value. And that makes up the final stat value. And that's how all of these things kind of can work together to create a very dynamic game. These things kind of can work together. Final stat value. This final value is. And that's how all of these things kind of can work together to create a very dynamic game. And we're going to get into this modified by this proficiency in just a second. But it's a really neat concept where when you add or remove points, you can optionally modify it by another just a little bit. So we have the min and max. So we have the min and max as well. For minimum, we're going to set that to 0. We don't need the experience to ever go below 0. And for rounding, we're just going to round that to a 0 decimal place. So it's always a whole number. Even if the player for some reason gets a half of an experience point, it will round up at that point. An important thing to remember, or above what the final value ends up being, but if you want hit points to always be at or above, make sure that the points are never below 0, and that's something that currently you have to code for, though I think I might make an update that'll add a min-max to the points as well.
I am going to make that update,
so you wouldn't have to code for that. If you see a min-max area for the points when you're watching this video, it's because I already updated it. But if you don't see that yet, then I haven't gotten around to making it. So let's get this experience working. Always a whole number. So let's get this experience working. And to do that, we need to get the experience onto the player character. Now, if you look at the stats repository, this is an object that comes in the repository prefabs, and it has to be in the scene. This is the way that in the scene. This is the way that the game stat, which is the runtime version of the stat, will connect itself with the experience stat. You'll notice that every stat and other objects in the game modules have this unique ID. It has to be unique, and you can copy that and paste it. This copies it to the clipboard, and you can copy that and paste it. This copies it to the clipboard, and that's how the things are all connected together. But we do need to get this stat into our character. And we already know that we have our game stat list here. And so we just need to get into that, we just need to get the stat into our character. We just need to get this stat into, but we do need to get the things are all connected together. But we just need to get the stat into that list. So we're going to do something on awake. On awake, we're going to say set up stats. Stats. And set up stats. And it's going to do a few things. This is where we're going to add stuff to a few things. This is where we're going to add stuff to the stats list. Now, the stats list. Now, you could create a list of stats and just drag them all over into your player so that you just have a list of stats. But instead, what we're going to do, we're going to use the dictionaries module in order to mark some stats as required. Now, if you click over to the dictionaries here, there's not much you can do because we haven't added any dictionaries yet. But if you click on Manage Stats, it'll load up this stat window, and here you can manage all your stats and here you can manage all your stats in a one-time view. But on here you can manage all your stats in a one-time view. But on the dictionaries panel, we can now add dictionary uh, dictionaries to that. So we're going to add one called required. And if we open this up, we can now expose these various values. So we're going to expose the Boolean value here. On the dictionaries, again, it's on the here on the dictionaries. Again, it's on the documentation site. These are all actually lists of these types, and you can expose them by simply clicking on them. They're all still on the object. We're going to go back now. They're only exposed if you click on that. So we're going to go back now and see that now our required Boolean is active. And I'm going to click yes on that, make that true. Now notice you can add any number of items to this list, and you can rearrange them and whatnot, but we can also delete them because we only need one for this. We're going to say that yes, experience is required. So now in our script, we're going to go through all of the stats on the stat repository that are required. So we can connect with the stats. So we can connect with the stats repository by typing in using static Infinity PBR modules stats repository.
Let's redo this voice. We're going to have to include the static stats repository for this. There's a repository. Oh man. All right, do it again. Take two. We're going to make sure we're using the static stats repository. There's a similar one for items, objects, and also for the loot repository as well.
Repository as well. And then we just have to say stats repository dot stat objects, and then we're going to use link where
I had to remember.
and also for the loot.
So I'm going to use link here to search for all of the required stats from the stat repository. Whoops.
So that So this link statement will give us a list of all of the stat objects on stats repository where dictionaries, value bool, required stats from the stat repository. So this link statement will all of the stat objects on stats repository where dictionary where dictionaries value bool required is true. Now in the dictionaries, again, check out the documentation on that, but if you call value bool, it's going to pull the first value in that list. So if you're only using one, it will pull index 0 and we'll get the value we want. And so we're going to do a for statement for each of these. So for each, we are going to say, so we're going to add them to the list. And to do that, we're going to so we're going. Hey, they're welcome.
Wrong buttons.
Each of these. So for each. So we're going to add them to the list. And to do that, we're going to say stats.add stat.uid. Stat.uid. Now, if you remember correctly, the reason why we choose the UID, because again, that unique ID, UID, is the thing that connects them between runtime and the scriptable objects. And if we look into this add method, what you see that it's really doing, it's bringing in the stats, it's bringing in the new owner, which is null by default, but we should assign that now, and whether or not it can be distinct or not. And again, by default, this is true. And it's going to check to make sure that we don't already have it. And if we do, then we're going to return that game stat. And then we're going to assign the new owner if it's assigned. And so let's make sure we pass in this object as the new owner, because this object implements I have stats. And that's going to tell the game stat that, hey, the owner of this stat is demo player. So if you have stats on enemies or objects or other things that have stats, then they will be owned by those things. All right. So now that means that every time we start any stat that exists, which is as required marked true, will be added to this list. So later on, if we've saved the game and we're going to add a new stat and we need it to be required, we just have to toggle that dictionaries object required true, and then next time we press play, it will be added here as well, and it will be in the saved and it will be in the saved and serialized hint on. So now in my simple demo scene, I've got a text field for experience and a button to gain 100 experience, and I want to basically give 100 experience to the player, and I'm missing my method because I typed it in earlier and I deleted it. I want to retype it in for you so you can see how we do basic things like give experience. So on my demo player, I'm just going to create a new public void give experience. It's going to take in a float value and new experience, we'll just call it exp, new XP, and so now we know that the stats is inside this list. there are many ways. So now we know that there are many ways to actually get the actual stat you want. The UID is the best way because it's the way the UID should never change. So even if you change the spelling or the name of a stat, the UID will stay the same and all your connections between that will stay the same. Therefore, I'm going to create a new public new experience exp. New XP. I'm going to create a new public stat.
See, I clearly can't both code and talk at the same time. Which is why I end up shutting up while I'm typing it.
So I'm going to create a serialized private stat experience stat. New XP. I'm going to create a new public stat. So I'm going to create a serialized private stat experience stat. That way we can always find the stat experience in the game stat through this UID. That way we can always find, and we can do that with this method here. Just stats get experience. That way we can always find the stat experience in the game stat through this UID. And we can do that with this method here. Just stats get experience stat UID. And then down here in give experience, we'll just call experience stat dot add points, and we're going to pass in new experience. In fact, we can shorten this up as well. And I will add, oops. And let's also add a null check as well right there to make sure that experience stat is, if it's not null, if it's null, it would throw an exception. So now if we look on our demo player, we have to populate this experience stat. So let's just bring that up there and let's press play and see what happens.
It's possible that nothing happens. Pretty sure nothing happens actually.
And before we press play, we have to make sure that the UI text here is going to display the correct information. And so let's just bring that up there. So now if we look up there and let's press, and before we press play, we have to make sure that the UI text here is going to display the correct information. And so I have a UID here. It's incorrect. I'm going to go with my experience. Click this copy UID, go over to here and just type in that UID there. If we look at the script, label is going to, at the script, there. If we look at the script, label is going to be set to the name of the object. And then basically, if the player set up, which means that we have on the text, then we're going to say UI text is going to give us the label, and then the player stat, get the final stat of this, get the UID from that, and then to get the final stat, and we're going to pass in the other level. So it's basically saying, hey, display the final stat of this UID, and when you display the final stat, pass in the other levels from the player. That's all those other things of this, get the UID from that, and then to get the final stat, and we're going to pass in the other level. So it's basically saying, we look at the script, label is going to, if we look at the script, it's basically saying, hey, display the final stat of this UID, and when you display the final stat, pass in the other levels from the player. That's all those other things like the equipment, modifications, conditions, other things that might implement things that might that might affect the final conditions, other things that might other things that might affect the final stat, which aren't part of the stat system directly. So let's see what happens.
Clearly nothing happened.
Now when we click the button, we are adding one. So now when we click the button, we are adding 100 experience points to the stat of experience. So let's take this one step forward, and let's say that we want to have a skill that the player can learn called learning. And this skill is going to increase the amount of experience the player gets when they get experience. So if you invest in this learning skill and upgrade it throughout the game, you're going to gain more experience than other players would from doing the same activities and actions. From doing the same from doing the same activities and actions. So let's go ahead and set that up right now. So I'm going to create a new folder here and call.
Apparently, Jason, you and I both like that word so.
So I'm going to create a new folder here and call this skills. And under the skills, I'm going to create a new stat, game modules, create stat, and call this learning. Now, learning, when we click on the main stats, and again, we can see it's a skill up here. Oh, and to keep this similar naming, I'm going to change that to just skill, singular. And I'm going to say this can be trained and call this learning. And I'm going to say this can be trained and it can be modified. Now, since it can be trained, we need to create some mastery levels. So let's go ahead and create that. Game modules create mastery levels. And we're going to call this main mastery levels. And we're going to call this main mastery levels. You can call it whatever you'd like. You can also have multiple mastery levels throughout the game. So if you have different skills that have a different leveling up system, you can have that. You can't manage the mastery level directly. You have to click this manage mastery levels here, and then you have to click the Manage Mastery Levels here, and then you'll get this window here. I'm going to dock it. You have to click this mastery level directly. You have to click the Manage Mastery Levels here, and then you'll get this window here. I'm going to dock it. And you can see there's going to be a drop down with all of your mastery levels. And then you've got options for mastery levels in the dictionaries. We're not going to use the dictionaries here. Instead, we're going to set up just 3 levels, including Master and Novice. We'll keep that one, Master and Novice and Expert. And then I'm going to rearrange this so that Novice is at the top and Master is at the bottom. And that's all we need to do there. Now when we go back to our skill and click on Learning, okay, we can see that we now have mastery levels, Novice, Expert, and Master listed here. So the first thing, I do want to make sure this always starts at 1. First thing I do want to make sure this always starts at 1. And this is because in this scene we're going to assume that if the player has the learning skill, they're at level 1, and that over time they can add more points, maybe maybe skill points, or they somehow leveling up or solving quests add points, but somehow they can get more points that's going to do different things. And that's what those things are set up here in the mastery levels area. And that's things. What those things are set up here in the mastery levels area. So at each level, you can have a different set of modifiable stats. Oh, we don't have, well, I guess we have to make sure our experience is modifiable stats. Oh. So on our mastery levels now, we have Novice, Expert, and Master. Each of these can modify other stats, but as you can see now, we don't have any other modifiable stats. Things are set up here in the mastery levels area. So on our mastery levels now, we have Novice, Novice, Expert. So the goal is that when you get learning skill, it modifies how much experience you get when experience you get when points are added. And so that comes into play here, this modified by this proficiency. So we need to actually add a new stat, and we're going to create this one. Game modules, create stat. Actually, for the and we're going to proficiency. So we need to actually add, for this one, let's just duplicate this. I want to show this concept. If you duplicate it, let's just duplicate this. So I want to show this concept. If you duplicate, it's very easy to make a new stat. I'm just going to rename this experience mod. And you can see it's renamed and all that. But this error here, it says that it has the same UID. That's a bad thing. All UIDs need to be unique. That's what the U stands for. And so on the new object, not on the old, and that's a very important point there. On the new one, I'm going to click Create New ID. It's going to get a new UID, and we're all set there. So this experience mod, this is going to be hidden from the player. The players aren't going to know that this exists. It's going to be here to help us get to the effect we want. And so the player's not going to see it being trained, but it can be modified. And by default, it's just going to have a proficiency of 0, which means no real effect. In fact, we don't even need to have a minimum and maximum for this. It just is going to be what it ends up being. So if we go back to our skill here and we click on our mastery levels, we can now see that there is the experience mod available to be modified by this object. So I'm going to click add. Now there's a lot going on here, and you can do some really fancy and clever things with the stat system and how they all affect each other. This one's going to be fairly basic. Right here on the left, we have our targets list. It's a column. You can add many targets to a single stat. And then we have the sources, and then we have the sources and the effects. Base and per skill point are always here. You can't get rid of them, but if the values are 0, then they will have no effect. The base is essentially saying, hey, if the player has learning novice, then add the base value and base proficiency, these static, whatever numbers they are, base proficiency to the experience mod. Since there's 0, 0 and 0 will be added, no effect. But this is just a one-time thing. It has no other modifications. It just says, hey, if you have it, you get this. And then the per skill point is going to be multiplied by the number of skill points in learning. Now again, we start learning off with 1, and as the player goes up, the effect from these two fields will go up because it's going to be multiplied by the skill point. So I'm going to say, hey, if you have learning, if you have obtained this skill learning, you're going to get a 10% boost to your experience at level 1, skill point 1. So we're going to say 0.09 proficiency as the base and 0.01 as the per skill point. That means that at skill point 1, you're going to have a total of 10%. That's 0.1, and if you add that time for the 1, you get 1.1 multiplied your final value, and you get a 10% boost to the final value. Total of 10%. And then the per skill point, percent. That's a point. So that's what we're doing here. Very straightforward, very simple. We'll get into the adding other sources later, but this is the good starting point here. Now I need to get these over to expert and master, so I'm just going to copy and then paste and paste. It makes it a little easier to get these over. And then from expert, we're going to double the values. So you start off with 20% at 1, and for master, we will triple the values. Easier to get these over, and then these over.
And we're going to double and triple the values for expert and master mastery. To get these over, and we're going to double and triple the values for expert and master mastery, so that you start off at 30% with skill point 1. All right. And then back on the stat experience, we're going to drag this experience mod over here. So this is going to say, hey, every time you add points or remove points, modify that value by the proficiency of experience mod. So let's see how that works in practice. But first, let's deal with a bunch of bugs I found. Not really bugs, just things I forgot to do. go.
All right, in our demo scene, I've added a toggle. This will cache the value. It's mod. All right, in our demo scene, I've added a toggle learning skill, and that's going to just call this toggle skill, passing in the UID of whatever we give this button. And it's going to check the skills and see if it contains that UID. And if it does, it's going to remove it. Otherwise, it's going to add it.
I think I actually updated that later in the video. Whoa.
Let's make sure we copy our UID and add that to the field here. Make sure it's the correct field. And then on the learning itself, we add a new script called UI skill, and we're going to paste in the UID as well. Whoops. The UID there as well. And let's check out this script. Let's make sure we copy our UID and let's make sure we copy our UID and add that to the field here. Make sure it's the correct field. And then on the learning itself, we add a new script called UI skill, and we're going to paste in the UID as well. Whoops. Whoops. The UID there as well. And let's check out this script. Essentially, it's saying if we have the skill with this method here, just player skills contains the UID, then we're going to show the label, and then player skills get the UID, and then mastery level name. Now, in a real project, hey there, welcome to the quick.
Gosh darn it. Too many hotkeys, too fast. Too fast, too furious. Nope, wrong button.
Level name. Now, in a real project, we probably want to cache this value, so we don't have to keep getting it. So what we can do here to showcase how you do that, we could say private gain it. Then public GameStat get, or GameStat get GameStat. And if GameStat is not equal to null, then return GameStat. Otherwise, we'll cache the value by saying GameStat equals get GameStat, and then return GameStat. And we will have to do one other check here, and we'll have to say if not player is set up, then let's actually move that up one. So if player's set up, then we will return null. Value, so we don't have to keep getting it.
So here I've written a method to cache the value, definitely slow down the video and check out the method if you'd want to use that in your project.
And we're going to say get game stat. So now instead, down here we could say game stat dot mastery level name. Now mastery level name is just one of the methods involved on the game stats list that will return the name of whatever is the active mastery level. It starts out at Now, one important thing to remember if you get random null reference errors is that the stats repository
I actually fixed that bug,
clicked on.
so we're going to ignore it.
Now, when we do not have learning, we gain 100. We can toggle our skill on, and we can see that we are low. We can toggle our clicked on this object. Now, when we press play. The active mastery level. Now when we press play, we can toggle our skill. We can toggle our skill on, and we can see that we are level novice, and we'll turn it off to turn it on. So now when we do not have learning, we gain 100 experience. We get 100 experience. Gain 100 experience. We do not have learning. Novice, and we'll turn it off to turn it on. So now when we
This bug was a silly bug, I think. It wasn't really, it was my fault.
All right, so I've created two buttons, one to reduce mastery by 1 and one to add mastery. Each one of these, let me just change this name. Each one of these is going to call a method. So let me just change this name. 1 and one to add mastery. Each one of these is going to call a method on the demo player, add mastery level or remove reduce mastery level. Each one of those is just going to call remove reduce mastery on the demo player, add mastery level or remove. Each one of those is just going to call change mastery level, passing the UID and the value of 1 or -1. So change mastery level is going to first try to get the skill at that UID, and if it can, it's going to call add to mastery level and the value. Now this is going to clamp the final mastery level between the minimum and maximum, so 0 and whatever the maximum is for the mastery level list you've provided. Level list you've provided. So let's go ahead and see what this does in practice. So now we can learn skill, learn the learning skill, and we can add the mastery level and remove and go between that. And you can see that the mod proficiency is automatically being recomputed as we go through. And now when we gain experience, we're gaining 130 because we're a master rather than a expert or a novice. But if we were an expert, we'd get 120. And of course, if we were a novice, we'd get 100 and, whoop, sorry. If we were a novice, we'd a expert or a novice bow. If we were an expert, we'd get 120. And of course, if we so now as a novice, we get 110. If we are an expert, we get 120. And as a master, we get 130 experience every time we gain 100 experience. It's being modified by 0.3. So we want to make sure that our...
So weird, Bug. I need to look into this. Somehow required was missing. Very odd. I was confused.
We're also going to make sure that the armor class is...
What? Apparently I missed some stuff.
Mastery level list you've provided. So now we can learn skill, learn this learning skill, and we can add the mastery level and remove and go between that. And you can see that the mod proficiency is automatically being recomputed as we go through. And now when we gain experience, we're gaining 130 because we're a master rather than a expert or a novice bow. If we were an expert, we'd get 120. And of course, if so now as a novice, we get 100. And as a master, we get 130 experience every time we gain 100 experience. It's being modified by 0.3. So we want to make sure that our we're also going to make sure that the armor class is required. And then we will go back to stats repository and make sure that gets added there. And let's add a readout here for armor class.
That's weird. Oh, I know. I accidentally didn't record that part because I kept pressing pause when I was recording, and I think I must have forgotten to record the part where I say let's set up armor class.
20. So we want to make sure that our... Now, of course, armor class starts at 0, but to show that we do have the stat as required. So let's create an item. So let's create or a novice bow. If we were an expert.
Now I've created an armor class stat as well using the same method, and we're going to move on to items. I don't think that worked.
Or a novice bow. If we were an expert, we'd get 120. Or a novice bow. If we were an expert.
And now I've created an armor class stat using the same method we did for the experience. That's fine.
So let's create an item that we can equip in order to modify our armor class. So I'm going to create a new folder called armor.
Whoops.
So I'm going to create a new folder called armor. And in this one, we're going to create a game modules create item object. So an item object, of course, can be something like a helmet. Object. Create game modules create item object. And we're going to call this helmet. Now an item object. So an item object, and we're going to call this helmet. Now an item object. So an item object, Now, an item object, of course, could be a helmet or a sword or something that you hold that's physical, but it can also be different things. You could make an item object for every enemy if that made sense for your project, or for other things that aren't physical. There's many ways to use it, but essentially it is a thing that can affect stats that might also show up in a loot box and might show up in the inventory. But you don't have to use it in loot box, you don't have to have it in the inventory, and you don't have to have it affect any stats. So there's a lot of ways to use the system in not so obvious patterns. But for the helmet, we are going to use the stats, and so I'm going to click there, and we're going to modify the armor class. We're going to add that to the list, and then we're just going to say that we're going to modify it by a base value of, say, 5. So now when you equip the helmet, you're going to have 5 armor class. 5 armor class. Pretty straightforward. So let's go back to our player. And now we need a list of equipment. And so we're going to create a public game item object list, and we'll call this equipment. I spell it right. So item object list is very simple. To game stat list, where it's the game version of item objects. It holds game item objects, which are the game version, the serializable runtime version of item object, which is what we just set up with our helmet. So now we're going to implement we're going to need a new method to gain and remove equipment. So we're going to create one called public void add equipment, and we'll call this equip, and on equip we're going to say equipment dot there's 2 methods to use here, add and transfer, or it holds a list of all the scriptable objects, but we can also pass it through here. So I'm going to say add new item object.
I think I redid all of this later in the video. I'm trying to just kind of skip forward to that.
So now we have a method called equip that gets a UID.
Let's just see if I can skip that.
So now we have runtime version of item object, so now we have a method called equip, and we'll call this equipment. So now we have a method called equip that gets a UID. This is going to be a UID of an item object, and it's going to say equipment add that item object by that UID. Now there is one other method. This will add a vanilla version, meaning a version stripped down of all the stuff on it. There's one other method. This will add a vanilla UID. Now there is called transfer, and transferring will and to do that, you'd pass in a game item object, and this will transfer that item object. Otherwise, you're going to want to use transfer, and that's going to transfer it, including all the data, to the new game item object list that you're passing it into. And of course, we can't forget that the owner is going to be this in both cases. And we want to make sure that we have the new owner. So object by that UID, and we want to make sure that we have the new owner. So for this demo, we're just going to be using the equip. So I'm going to skinny these methods up. We want to make sure that we have the new owner. So we're going to use equip, and then after equipping, I'm going to make sure that we set dirty all the things that whatever the equipment is affects. So we're going to say var new.
Oh yeah, this was the thing I need to add to the IAM object.
And then on new equipment, we're going to call set dirty.
Because that doesn't actually work right now. Turns out I meant to add it before, but I never did. So now it doesn't work, and it took me quite a few minutes to figure that out.
So now for each stat in the new equipment directly affects list, this is going to be a list of all the different stats that this equipment might affect. We're going to call stats set dirty for that UID, and also skills set dirty for that UID. Now, if you pass in a parameter, a UID, then it's going to set only just one UID. But if you pass in null or no parameter here, then it will set dirty for all of the game stats in this list.
That's a feature I add because of this video.
So in this case, we're only going to do the ones that are being directly affected by this. And of course, those will set dirty all the things that affect it or are affected by it as well. So we're also going to add an unequip script or an unequip method where we pass in the UID. And first we're going to check. So we're also going to add an unequip script or an unequip method where we pass in the UID. And first we're going to check that we actually have the equipment. If we don't, then we're just going to return. The first thing we'll do if we do have the equipment, though, is set all of those same values to dirty, and then we will remove it from the list. We're going to call these to set dirty before we remove it, otherwise it might not be there.
Oh yeah, I think I actually redid this again.
So I've got the two buttons here, and I'm going to pass in the UID from the item. It might not be there in the list. We're going to call these to set dirty before we remove it, otherwise we will remove it from the list. So I've got the two buttons here, and I'm going to pass in the UID from the item object, helmet, into those. I'm going to make sure that I have my repository. Pass in the UID from the item object, helmet, into those. I'm going to make sure that I have my repository here. So my repository prefabs are right here. Bring the item repository up. Similar to the stats repository, it's going to list all of the item attributes and item objects that we have in the project. And we want to make sure we click on that after we add any new items, just to make sure it populates. So let's go and press play. And our armor class is 0, so let's go ahead and equip the helmet. And we get a null reference exception. Okay, so now we have our final equip method and an unequip method as well. In the equip method, we're going to equip the vanilla version of the object and then set our stats and skills to dirty so they recompute. And then also we're going to, on unequip, first make sure that we have it equipped, and if we do, set those to dirty and then remove the equipment.
Thought I redid it.
So now we can see that it's actually working. When we remove it, it removes from the list, and when we add it, it adds. And first we're going to check that we game stats in this list. So we're skill set dirty for that UID. Now make sure that we have the new owner. So now for each stat in the new equipment directly affects list, this is going to be a list of all the different stats that this an unequip method where we pass in the UID. And first we're going to check. So I've got the two buttons here, and I'm going to pass in the, going to make sure that I have my repository from the item. As well. Make sure that we have the new owner. Okay, so now we have our final equip method and an unequip method as well. And remove the equipment. So I've got the two buttons here, and I'm going to pass in the UID from the item object helmet into those. I'm going to make sure that I have my repository here. So my repository prefabs are right here. Bring the item repository up. Similar to the stats repository, it's going to list all the item attributes. So now we can see that it's actually working. When we remove it, it removes from the list, and when we add it, it adds. But our armor class is not changing, and there's a reason for that. And this is goes back to what we talked about at the beginning about the get other levels. So see that the get other levels. So the stats will automatically recompute themselves when their own values change, and they'll branch out and recompute all the other effects or stats that they affect or are affected by them when their values change. But an item object is not part directly of the stats system, so we need to pass that in here. And so in our in our get other levels method, which is required by the implementation of I have stats, we're going to start by creating a list of other modification levels. So modification levels, and we're going to pass in those levels. And we're going to pass in those levels. And so I'm going to uncomment this part. This is from the demo scene, and so we're going to modify it just a little bit and say for each game item object in equipment.list, that's the list of that's attached to the equipment, the list of that's attached to the equipment, the game item object list. We're going to say other modification levels. Just add this game item object modification level. Now this will pass the active modification level of that other thing. If it only has one, it's only going to get one. If it has multiple, then it will return the active one based on whichever one is active. And then it will return the active one based on whichever one is active. And then we're going to return that list. And so anytime that we recompute, it's going to call, if it has an owner, and this is why it's so important to pass the owner. If it has an owner, it's going to gather all of these other modification levels and make that part of the computation levels and part make that part of the computation. So let's give that a try. So now when we equip the helmet, we have armor class 5. Now we can't equip it anymore, we already have it. armor class 5. Now we can't equip. We have armor class 5. Now we can't equip it anymore. We already have it. But we can remove it and add armor class 5. So we can do a little bit more. So we can do a little bit more though with that. And let's say that we want to have us with that. And let's say that we want to have a special object, a helmet that does something cool, like maybe increases your learning. And so we're going to make an item attribute that can modify the helmet so that when you have the helmet with that attribute, it actually gives you the armor, plus it gives you a boost to your learning skill. Plus, it gives you a boost to your experience mod skill. Armor plus it gives you a boost to your plus it gives you a boost to your experience mod skill. So I'm going to create a new folder here, and we're just going to call this buffs. You can name it whatever you'd like. Buffs. You can name it whatever you'd like, but in this one, I'm going to create a new item attribute, and we're going to call this. What are we going to call this? Of genius. Of genius. Item something of genius. So an item attribute is something that describes something and modifies it. Now, you could have an item attribute for your character race and your character class, and you can add that directly to the player just as an item attribute. There's many ways of doing it, but in this case, we're going to make this be something that modifies an item. So modifies an item so that we're going to eventually have an helmet of genius. So in our settings, we have a couple things for the item object. We have a couple things for the item object. For the human name, this is going to be the thing that the player sees. I'm going to just use the name here of genius. And in the name order, it's going to be 1, which is fine. I'm actually going to make it 5. Anything after 0 will come after the object name. Anything before 0 will come before the object name. And then in our stats, we want to change the experience mod. So we're going to add that. And in our stat list, we're going to say, let's say, give ourselves an extra 5% boost to our experience. So our proficiency is just going to be added 0.05 rather to the 0.05 rather to the experience mod, simply by having the of genius in our experience mod, simple genius in our list of modifications. All right. So currently it's not actually on the object. So we're going to create a method to add that to the So I've created a new button, and for the purpose of this demo, we're going to create a method to add that to. So I've created a new button, and for the purpose of this demo, we're just going to boilerplate this and say equip helmet of genius. Obviously, this is something you probably do differently in your game, but for this, I just want to demonstrate how to create an object of this type and then transfer it into the inventory of the player. And so the equip helmet of genius is going to do a couple things. I added parameters or fields up here for helmet and of genius. So we're going to say var new object equals new helmet new object var new helmet equals new game item object, and we're going to pass in our item object. So this is going to be helmet, and then this, and then we're going to say new helmet dot gain add attribute dot add attribute, and we're going to pass in our attribute UID. And this is going to be a vanilla version of that. And you can see the options here, whether it has to be distinct. That way you could have multiple if you wanted to. Perhaps they are like accolades on a jacket, and you can have as many as you want. Or they can be something like this, where there's probably only going to need to be one of this type. So we're going to add only just the one. And then we're also going to recompute the human name of genius. So let's pass in of genius. Whoops. So let UID and pass in of genius. So let's pass in of. So let's pass in of genius. Oops. UID, and yes, it's got to be distinct, and yes, let's recompute that name. All right, and then once we have that new game item object, we're going to say equip transfer and pass that in. And then after we equip, we're going to want to set these to be dirty as well. And once again, make sure we click on the items repository so that the attribute there gets updated, and let's press play. So now let's click the helmet of genius.
Yeah, nothing happens for a while.
One thing I want to point out real quick is I actually should have been adding range and game item object modification levels, which will include all. If we click into that, modification levels will get modification levels, plural, which will turn the modification level for the item object itself. It's an important distinction there. Let's go ahead and press play.
And still nothing happened.
And it didn't work. So now let's equip the helmet of genius. We can see our armor class went up by 5 and our experience mod proficiency went up by 0.5. So if we gain experience, we're gaining 105. Now if we get learning skill, then we actually have even bigger bonus to our experience mod. So there you go. That's a very basic simple setup for combining the stats with other stats and with different things like item objects and item attributes. Obviously, this goes much deeper. Take a look at the demo scene. That has a lot more stats, a lot more connections between the stats, including some item objects and whatnot. And so definitely check that out and come to the Discord if you have any questions. And don't forget to check the documentation. Spent a lot of time working on that, so I expect you to read it. All right. Thanks. Have a great day, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks.
There it is. 27-minute video. But I think that's okay, because it was pretty straight to the point for the most part, and it gets the basics down, talking about stats, talking about connecting stats together using some of the other techniques to pre-connect them in various ways, like the mod, getting that concept down that, hey, you know, sometimes you can have stats the player doesn't see that actually affect things, that maybe that's how you get everything working, where you know, you have experience, but another stat can influence that you hadn't thought of when you were thinking of experience. And then, of course, item objects and item attributes. All right, so the next step is going to be doing zooms and other such things, and levels and all that. But it's been 2 hours, and I want a break because it's been 5 hours that I've been sitting in this chair, except for getting lunch. That's too long to be sitting, so I need to go for a walk. Thank you all for joining. If you do have questions on the game modules or anything else, come to the Discord, and I will see you later.